It's it's definitely a controversial subject, and I think a lot of things were said in the movie that maybe hit something positive or negative inside of you. I know it did for me, and some of the people up here too. So I guess we'll start. I'm just going to have everybody introduce themselves, and then we'll kind of go over ground rules and how this is going to work. So I'm going to ask everyone to say their name, their role in the community, and why they are standing right here. And I will start. My name is Kyla. I have a bunch of different roles here, most of which are hanging out with teenagers. I work at the rec room. I work at Flex through the center. I work at Howell in the summers. Yeah, and I'm super passionate about this subject. I wrote my thesis in grad school about war in the Congo and about how masculinity constructs kind of play into where aid is delivered. So that's kind of the broad scale, but also like hanging out with teens a lot and being a person with a gender, I am affected by this, just like everybody else, and see it in the people around me. So that's why I care.
I'm Bill Choate, and I'm an expert in masculinity. So no, I grew up here, and father, grandfather, I've evolved here. So I saw myself all through that.
My name is Segura. I'm new in town. I've been here about 8 months, kind of a seasonal worker, I guess you could say. And yeah, I'm interested in this conversation, and because it's a topic that we need to talk about, and also because this is a topic I'm interested in. So yeah, happy to be here. Happy you're here.
My name's Abram Salzmann. I'm a senior at Homer R.E.C, and I'm here to try and represent the younger voice of that as best as I can.
Hi, I'm Partridge. I guess roles in the community, I'm the psychology professor here at the college. I'm also on the board of directors for the community mental health. I'm very invested in the Boy Scouts. I'm the local Cub Master for Pack 555 and assistant Scoutmaster for Troop 555. And then on top of all that, this is the conversation. This kind of conversation is important to me because I'm also the father of 5 sons. So yeah, this is where I live.
My name is Kurt Leffler. I'm the executive director at Cape Marshall Athletics. I'm also the head coach of the LFS College Fight Team, which is a combat sports team here in town. Other roles I have in the community, I'm also on the board of directors over at Community Mental Health. And why I'm here is I'm a husband and I'm a father. And I'm invested in this community and its future. So this message is important.
Cool, thanks for being here. Cool, so I'm gonna try and keep this brief, but before we get started, I want to recognize first and foremost that gender is a spectrum, and that this movie maybe doesn't talk about people who identify somewhere in the middle, but that is equally important, and I would like to encourage everyone to consider that when speaking up. Also, there are some ground rules for the panel discussion. I want to try and include audience, so I'm going to ask, I have questions. I guess if you guys have questions and you guys are cool with opening it up, because I know you've all seen my questions, then we can open it up to other questions as well. When I ask a question, I'll pass it off to one of you guys, and then if you want to pick someone, if somebody else wants them to say something, feel free to pass it off to them as well. Ground rules. Remember, gender is a spectrum. Personally, I like to talk about masculinity and femininity because we each have both of those traits. This is a weighted subject, so please be respectful. Our goal is to really hear what each other has to say on this subject, so even if you disagree, please use kind words. Deeply listen. Don't just listen with the thought of what you want to say next, but listen to what the person is actually saying. And watch how much space you take up. So be aware of how much you're speaking. Make space for the voices of others in the room. If you notice you're talking a lot or you've gone on for a long time, keep it brief so that others have space to talk. If you're someone who likes to talk a lot, please be extra aware of that. Cool. Is that cool with everybody? All right. So my first question is just, what are your initial thoughts? What resounded with you and what didn't? Does anybody want to go first?
Yeah, I think it's a great movie to get us all on the same like starting field so we can have the conversation from the same starting point. That's my, it gives us a good idea of how masculinity exists or how it's being taught in a contemporary way to both youth and how it was also taught to our fathers and grandfathers. And so it's, yeah, like I said, it's a good starting point for us to kind of, okay, this is where we're at. And now we can kind of, everybody is nuanced from that. So it's a good starting point. Anyone else have any kind of initial thoughts out there? Any great initial thoughts?
I can vote up. Yeah. All right, so I had a few initial thoughts, actually. I wrote down so I could keep myself organized, or as close as I get anyway. So as far as a good starting point for the conversation, I think that is what this movie can be. I think it offers the opportunity to start a conversation. I mean, I know I've told a couple folks that if, for me personally, if nothing else came of this whole experience, it prompted me to sit down with my boys and ask them, what does this mean? I mean, I've spent a lot of time with the assumption that, if I walk the walk and talk the talk, that I'm doing everything I need to do, and I think at some point forgot to kind of check in and kind of grade myself on how well I'm doing. And so this gave me the opportunity to do that, and for that, I'm really grateful. As far as my initial thoughts on the movie, I have to admit I'm not the biggest fan, and for a couple of reasons. There are a couple ways you can influence a person, how you can change the person's mind. There's one route is the central route, where you use logic and numbers and provide them information so they can critically make up their own mind. Another route is fear, and this one kind of reminds me a little bit that way. The fact that the discussion of masculinity is a discussion of rape and mass shootings and bullying and suicide and all these really big, scary things, and then tying it back specifically only to masculinity is a little disingenuous. And some of you may have been a little bit surprised at some of the big numbers out there. The one that got me actually doing research on this topic, and there's a little bit there, was the 35% of men would rape if they could get away with it. That number's just not right. If you actually go and look at the data, it's still too high. I mean, the number is actually closer to 12%, which is just egregious. But at the same time, there's some factual, maybe misrepresentations or interpretations that I did not appreciate. But other than that, the fact that all of y'all are sitting here and willing to have this discussion, it's all, that's what's really important.
A couple of my initial thoughts. This was, I think, the 16th time I've watched this documentary. When we talk about being prepared, I'm a little over-prepared, so hooray for you too. A thing that really struck out to me with this is this issue about community and culture. A big thing that I deal with a lot with working with youth, especially in combat sports, is a lot of the young men that I deal with come from single-parent homes, typically raised by their mothers. And this is due to vocation, circumstance, or just that's how life is. So a lot of the things they're talking about, learning about masculinity, both negative and positive, it all really boils back to this idea of culture, identity, and parenting, and this need for a community. I know within like a military culture, coming from a veteran culture, we're all looking for a community to belong to because we have that brotherhood while we're in, but when we get out, where is that? And that speaks to a larger issue when we're talking about the next generation moving forward about what does it mean to be a man? Well, first, let's talk about our culture. Let's talk about our identity. Let's talk about our community. That all boils back to the home. So that's the main thing that really stuck out with me is that main part. There's a lot that I enjoyed about the video, 16 times now, but there's also a lot of it that, of course, I got a little offended by it, and rightfully so. And hopefully everybody else did, got a little offended and also found some really good into it. So I'm pretty sure my peers on here have a couple of nodding heads as well.
I enjoyed that movie. To be honest, I didn't feel like I could relate to a lot of it. I think that we have a strong community here, and I feel like personally I have a really good relationship with my father, so I didn't feel quite as connected, but at the same time I recognize how in this community, despite the fact that it is strong, there is still plenty of opportunities for it to grow and for us to have this conversation.
Boy, every word in there speaks to me in some way as a person who grew up without strong male role models. But it all touched me somewhere. You know, it was made to emphasize these negative things, which are present, and that's what it was about. So I don't think it was tainted. I feel like that was its mission, and somebody else could make one the other side, which I probably wouldn't like as well.
Is anybody burning to say something? Otherwise, I'll ask another question. Okay, cool. So my next question, which is a little bit harder to answer, what is your definition of masculinity, or what qualities do you associate with it? And how has that been informed? You're putting that.
I can go. Sure.
Okay.
I had preview for this question even, and I still have trouble coming up with a nice solid. I can tell you when I asked my boys that what I got back was what I thought I'd been putting out there, and it was do the right thing even when it hurts. It was about responsibility. It was about basically standing up. And then at some point, I think my wife asked, well, if you had a daughter, would any of these characteristics have been different? And my answer was either no. And so that made me start thinking, okay, well, wait a minute. Is it really, this is the definition here specifically for manhood, or is this the definition for just being a good person? I know as a leader in the Boy Scouts, we talk about the Scout law, trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent, right? Took me a second, I got there. And we talk, I talk about that being the recipe for creating a good man. Well, realistically, that's the recipe for creating a good citizen. And so the idea that these characteristics blend across genders, sure, absolutely. I mean, I have no problem with that one. As far as where my personal definition came from, I mean, it comes from a bunch of different places. First and foremost is my own father, who was, a phenomenal influence, still is, still my hero. I also get it from my faith. A lot of religions have some definition of roles, and that certainly plays a part in how I try to live my life and how I try to pass on my personal ethos to my children. And then also from culture, grew up down south in Texas, played football, did all the little small town Texas things. So it came from a bunch of different places, I think. And then somewhere in there I got an education, and that I'm sure colored it as well.
Yeah, I think masculinity is very subjective, obviously. It's kind of defined by, I think you said, your community, your role models, your friends. So for me, yeah, masculinity was defined by my father and my hometown. But when I'm talking to a broader audience, masculinity is, the way I kind of think of it is, the stereotypical kind of interpretations of, how it exists in its farthest, notion. It's all those things as a Boy Scout, is something to be a man, but it's also where that takes place, right? In the woods. I remember that was kind of a big thing, versus Girl Scouts takes place, this has changed obviously, but for me it was very like, Girl Scouts are in this atmosphere, whereas Boy Scouts are in this atmosphere, and while we may be learning some great fundamental values that parallel each other, we are ultimately learning them in different atmospheres and learning how to apply them differently. But, for me, masculinity is like defined personally for me by how my dad represented it and how other males represented it. And then it's also defined for me by how our broader culture represents it. And that sits next to the stereotypical kind of interpretations of it. Don't cry. A lot of what we saw here are those outlier, those very kind of strong, dominant versions of what it is to be a masculine person in our society. So, I have two interpretations, I guess, is my point.
For me, I think my definition comes first and foremost from my peers, like constantly spending time around the same group of guys. We come to like define masculinity for our group and maybe not everybody else. So that I think has the biggest influence for me. And beyond that, absolutely, the culture that the movie talked about of mass media and generally society. Yeah.
You want to take a bill?
Yeah, when I was Cameron's age, I would have just spewed out a definition just like that. But the older I've gotten, the blurrier things have gotten. We used to use the word effeminate, which when I was your age, I would insult someone by saying they were effeminate. But now I think of that as a compliment, as a compliment. So yeah, it's foggier than it has ever been in my life, and hopefully it'll continue to get foggier.
Just like the rest of the panel here, all of us had a father at one point, whether they're active or not in our lives. But in my case, where the definition of masculinity, it comes from father figures. I had a wonderful adoptive father, who raised me up as an orphan. So there was that. I also had the roles of uncles. I had roles of a social community. We were highly involved with the military community. So there was that stereotypical role there. And as I became a man, that was further enforced by being in the military. However, on the other side of all that, it was strongly enforced about the toxic standpoint of being a male in the military. And there's some toxic women in the military as well. It's just toxic culture in general. So when we talk about a positive or even negative sense of masculinity, the traits that really spoke about this is that issue of, to be a good human being is to be a good human being, whether male or female. And to reinforce those positive structures would be just to accept that we're not different necessarily as in roles, but the fact is we're talking about men and women working together as a culture and society. So definition of masculine and feminine, yeah, there are nuances within the dictionary, but the fact of the matter is, to be good people, you have to be good people. It does not matter in the long scope of things. It's, again, blurry. So, because the fact is, when you stack somebody up against a male or a woman stacked up against each other, whether in the tendency of being a good person or not a good person, all those traits end up being the same in a lot of ways. So masculinity, femininity, that's a blurry definition. That's something left up to syntax and language. But it really holds no weight for me.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'd like to say something.
I don't know who that was. Yeah, sure. Yeah, you can yell.
Watching this film and being a mother of a 50-year-old son and have a grandson, and watching, these little kids, and they're just so open and to love and caring and want it. And you're getting into these 15, 16-year-old kids that haven't had great role models, and then looking at this group of individuals in prison, that even the ones that are on all the spectrum, all that, I think
Thank you. Any, you want?
Yeah, if I can say something. I think there was a statement and a question in there, but I guess I can speak. If you said you're a mother of two.
Mother of one son and one grandson.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So I would say the one thing that's helped me stay, first off, just however your son and grandson present themselves, obviously just love them for who they are. But secondly, like as a young man who is trying to, I have my family definition of how I can represent my masculinity, and it's often more comfortable than how it is outside, and there's the conditions that condition me. But I would say having my mom just be a mother, just being a constant source, no matter if I was, being rebellious or not, she was constantly there reminding me of what was good and what was bad, and never stopped, and is always there still. And my mom has been the number one person to blur the lines and remind me that you're looking at it in a very skewed perspective. And there's been times where I definitely did not listen, but having that constant force has inevitably changed me and been a gift in life. So I would say that's my answer as a young man to a mother, is just be there constantly and be the force that has to sometimes be the bad news bearer about what is good. And it's no fun, but being that force is super, super positive in a young man's life.
I agree with that, there's a lot of children that don't have male role models. And communities are great, do everything we can to evolve that, but I really think that young boys should see women also ask and expect respect from men.
What was that last
And
part?
when they see that, I think that is their good role model that they can see coming just from, being in a family. I really do think it's important.
Yeah, I mean,
Anyway, that's my take.
yeah, I would definitely agree with that. The learning to be a good man or a good woman doesn't just come from the same gender parent or the same gender people around you. I mean, you get feedback from mom and dad. You get from grandmother and grandfather. You get it from aunts and uncles and female neighbors and male neighbors. I mean, the feedback you get is from all of that. And if it's all positive feedback, whether it's coming from a man or a woman, it's all going to be part of that building process. Expecting respect and role modeling respect is phenomenal. Yeah.
To add a story, the greatest role model in my life was actually a woman. This woman took me into her home after being homeless. And the big thing that she was trying to engender is care and responsibility and sacrifice. And sacrifice, quite honestly, could be a true definition of love. Obviously, my parents weren't around at that point, and she, as a single mom, encouraged, required, and demanded accountability. I couldn't be strung out on her couch. I couldn't be out screwing around. She required, demand, and taught sacrifice and accountability. Now, to flip it the other way around, what was taught to me by my father, every time I would get into a difficult situation, typically for something from combat sports or a large thing of note, he would tell me two things. He'd say, first, son, I love you, and the second one would be, remember who you are. The funny part about that, flipping it over to this woman named Marvell, she would say the same things, is, I love you, remember who you are. And that's not even unique to the family paradigm that I grew up in. But that all boils back to that accountability, that sacrifice, that demand, and demand's a strong word. I would say that instruction of respect, honor, and things that are beyond gender-specific terms. It's just those teaching to be good people. So, and my response for that is, if you're demanding it by teaching a better example, then your sons, your grandsons, and your daughters will learn those things of value. And there's a lot of women, and I can attest to this with the work that I do, that prove that to be true. They demand their sons to be better, and they raise them to be better, and to succeed as a result of it. Hopefully that answers the question.
It does, thanks.
I just kind of have a little flag goes up when I hear good man and good woman, because those those definitions are so fluid. And I know a lot of bad parents that think they're good parents, and their peers think they're good parents. And so, you know, before I use that as a benchmark, I'd want to define it a little better. One thing the movie pointed out to me was the coach, the role of a coach can be both positive and negative. And it can be, you know, in my view, it can really be extreme in either direction. But watching my grandson play football at the age of 10 and seeing adults, supposedly responsible adults, standing on the sidelines yelling to their kid, hit him, hit him. To me, that's child abuse. You know, it's not only being a bad parent, but it's abusive. But they think they're a good person, and so do their peers. So, you know, good person kind of is out there in the wind for me.
Does anybody out there want to say something? I hear whistling.
I think the biggest thing that this movie touched on, and it's not really in regards to gender roles. The idea of gender roles are what this movie's trying to break down, because I think what this movie's trying to say is that men are treated differently, and that's what makes them have these negative aspects. So the biggest thing that I saw was that there was empathy introduced to these men who couldn't see it because they were restricted by these roles. So when they could see that, it changed their whole lives. Like the man with the son, and the men seeing, you know, that we don't need to be violent, and that we have these feelings, and being able to put themselves in each other's shoes, it makes them more human and less of a definition of a man. And I think that's really the entire goal here, because it shouldn't be about whether you fall into what your sex expects or your gender expects. It should be falling into virtues to create a better society that way. And that, as was echoed by pretty much everyone on the panel and in the audience, echoes through every good human that someone should look up to.
Does anybody have something to say to that? I have one right here, and then I'll go back there.
This is a question for the panel. A quote that really stood out to me was the young man talking about the letter that he gave to his English teacher, and he said, "I needed to hear that, and I needed to hear that from a man." And I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit about your experience with all-male spaces and whether you feel like they're important or not.
Hold that thought if you had a thought, and we'll come back.
I'll start here maybe and go there, because I think like one thing is, yeah, this movie is about people being introduced to empathy, but it's how are men introduced to empathy, and how difficult is it for that man to really show that and experience it, given the conditions that they grew up in being a man. So I think that's, you know, while it's breaking down, I agree with what you said, I think it's perfect, but I also think it is focused on, you know, how does a man experience that, and how is he introduced to it, and once he's introduced to it, how does he cope with it? And I think, like, going to your question, if anybody wants to move to hers or jump to his before I would say, like, yeah, all male spaces are extremely important. It goes back to the coach concept that we were just kind of talking about. There's usually a hierarchy within like an all-male room. And that hierarchy doesn't necessarily mean like one person has more power, but there's a lot to learn from each person and how they fit into a group, and especially how males operate within a group. Like we said about the coach, if you have a great group of men, it's just like anybody in any atmosphere. If you have a great group of men that you're around, a great group that could be in many, many different things, then you're gonna start to adopt those characteristics. You're gonna start to adopt those habits. You know, my mom always told me, My mom and dad always told me, if you hang out with people who do drugs, Cameron, you're gonna do drugs. If you hang out with people who drink, you're gonna drink. If you hang out with people who read, you're gonna be in a book club. It's just that simple. And I think that's very applicable to all male groups too. It's like, if I hang out with men that, you know, aren't really, they're not so connected to this binary idea of like, what is a man? And they're just like, yeah, I mean, you're a dude and you like to paint and that's awesome. You know what I mean? Then I'm gonna think painting is awesome. But if I'm hanging out with people that really think creativity is kind of this girls thing, then I'm gonna lock that down because I'm perceiving that, I'm learning that my male peers don't like that. And if my male peers don't like that, then there's a huge group of people that I want to fit into that aren't accepting me. So answer.
I think to just piggyback right off that, you said like, depending on the group of all males that you're spending your time with, that's what's gonna influence you. So yeah, I think spending time, you asked like the importance of all male spaces. I think it can be really helpful if you choose the right all male space versus perhaps not the right all male space for you, whatever that might be. I felt like I've always had great all male spaces to go to, whether it be like a soccer team or just the group of friends that I have that are all guys. So I think that's been really helpful. Yeah.
To answer both, empathy. Empathy is incredibly important. I mean, I talked about how my father would tell me those two things, but the fact is, when we're talking about emotion in a specifically or contextually appropriate time frame, when I'm breaking down in tears in the middle of the highway going 80 miles an hour, that is a time not necessarily to show emotion. That's a time to use a phrase to self-compartmentalize that pain or that emotion there. We talk about taking pain and turning it into purpose, power, and peace, but a lot of that boils down to being able to take that emotion in that context when it's inappropriate and learn how to process it later. Now, a lot of people bottle it up, and that's a bad idea in general, but there's certain times when emotion is not necessarily the right answer. When I got bullets flying, people around me dying, that's not a time to sit down and break down. That's a time to get the job done, get into the fight, and then when the mission is not present, then I can process that grief. I can process that empathy, process that care. And that goes back to the all-male spaces. Coming from a military background, specifically an infantry background, it was all male. And there was incredible toxicity in it. It's actually one of the reasons why I left the military, because I wanted to be around men who are about their spouses, men who are about their children, men who wanted to be positive, uplifting leaders. Now, the flip side to that is, through the immense amount of danger, work, and effort, we had incredible amount of empathy and care for each other. Men congratulated men on their children. Men processed through grief together in these all-male settings. So there is, again, it's the society that you're around, the men, the women, the group that you're around, and making sure that when it's contextually appropriate and learning when it's contextually appropriate, how to introduce emotion, empathy, and how to process all that in a social structure. Hopefully that answers. Now, Billy, got anything?
As far as all-male space, I'm actually of two minds on this one, and it's something that's fairly relevant to me right now is the Scouts Goes co-ed. One of the things about all-male space is that boys act differently when they're around boys, and they act differently when they're around girls. When boys, in a room full of boys, they are silly and they're goofy and they can make mistakes and not get completely embarrassed and mortified. If you add a girl in the mix, it does change the dynamic. Is that a bad thing? I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't have the answer. But they are different.
Yeah, I operate a boat where I take people on 2-week trips at times. Sometimes they're all men, and sometimes there's a few women, and it's like night and day. When it's all men, they fart a lot more, they swear a lot more.
That's a very good point.
So that's all I have to add.
think another thing that's important to attach to that is that the frequency, if you're just spending all your time with just males, you're gonna end up like farting all the time and not understanding why that's kind of disgusting, and like, you need to be a little more civil. But if you mix it up and you're 50-50, yes, those all male groups can be, it is, I am like proud to be a man, and so learning about how to do that and learning that from certain characters, I only see that character come out in all male circles sometimes. And when it's an all male circle where that character, when they come out, they're freer and they're more concerned with, opening up instead of being like this thing that males are supposed to be. It's liberating, Whereas when you see a man in front of women or in mixed circles, sometimes you're learning about how to be a man in a mixed circle. It's very, you know what I mean? So as long as you're doing it 50-50, you're good.
I see a question in the front. Okay. That's good.
I just want to kind of bring up the all male or not all male, and all of it, like, I think speaks to the authenticity of presenting, or like the movie The Face, and being authentic, and whether or not all male spaces are important. Again, I think it comes down to something beyond male or female, and whether or not being in all male spaces frees us or allows us to be authentic, or I think that we should be able to be authentic, period. And I think that the, like, becoming better humans, I think we're on the right track when we're talking about that discussion. But I think separation is part of the issue, and what's allowed in all male circles versus all human circles, and how we present, I think, is part of the issue, and that we really need, as people, to figure out how to develop people ourselves. And I think the validation from other people and wanting to feel included and be a part of and be validated by other people, whether it be a partner or another male or a group or whatever it is, I think part of that is at the core of the issue of people not being able to be authentically them, and fear of being accepted as being human. And I think that's what we really kind of need to overcome as humans, is accepting everyone as human, and we're already part of the club. Like, there's no club that we need to be part of. There's no validation that we need from all males or from co-workers or from some girl or some guy. Blah, blah, blah.
I'll just grab the mic a minute while it's so close and try to be brief, although pretty hard for Kilchers to be brief. Bring up the subject of sex. Pretty hard to separate sex, gender, and masculinity and femininity. Reminds me of the old Harry Belafonte song, when I was a little boy, 3'3", certain questions occurred to me, so I asked my father quite seriously to tell me the story about the bird and the bee. Well, he stuttered and stammered quite pathetically, and then he said to me, blah, blah, blah. Last verse, traveled over land and over sea, trying to find the answer to the bird and the bee, and now that I am 93, I don't give a damn, you see. So I think we hear a lot in our society about what males shouldn't do, how you shouldn't flirt, how you shouldn't compliment. Okay to tell a woman the dress looks good, but not to tell her she looks good. In the dress, it's in the news every day about very inappropriate men and how they, coming on to women or expressing their sexuality or trying to get sex or whatever, very inappropriate, very abusive. And I think it's pretty clear that there needs to be a lot more education from the time boys are little about this is good. You are a boy. You do have these arousals. You do look at girls at some point a little differently, but here is okay. Here, it's okay to feel these things, and this is okay way to be a boy or to be a man. And like my friend Billy, it's getting fuzzier and fuzzier, and I'm old enough now where I'm not sure if it's gonna get less fuzzy, but I still think it needs to be brought up by churches, by schools, by fathers, by mothers to teach boys what is okay, because we hear every day what isn't.
Thank you. I'm going to interject something really fast. You see you pointing to the back. I'll go back there. But first, I'm just going to interject something that came up for me when you said that, even though this is not my space to talk. That when I compliment my female friends, instead of saying things about the way they look, I try to say things about every other quality about them. I think that's something that everybody can do to accept how they appreciate other people, but maybe not just focus on how they look. So like, I think you're really intuitive, or I think you're super smart. That was my thought. Who was in the back that had a burning thing?
I just wanted to mention two things that I thought were really beautiful about this film, and the one was the father and son who had the box that they put the little comments in, and it's something that I've seen from my generation. I did not see boys able to be vulnerable and able to be sensitive, and I'm almost 50, and it's something that as I'm raising two daughters, who one just graduated from Homer High last year and one's a senior now, where I see these young men so much more able to show sensitivity and vulnerability, and I was always a little mad at my husband because I wanted more children. I really wanted to be able to raise a boy because I thought I could raise one really well. But actually there's a lot of women out there here in Homer and elsewhere that have done beautiful jobs raising beautiful boys, where they have more permission to take that mask off that I think for eons they've had to wear, this mask of vulnerability or this mask of whatever masculinity is, and being able to see, I mean, my daughter Chloe and her boyfriend Jake last year, I mean, just the vulnerability and the sensitivity that I saw Jake show just touched my heart so much, and I really enjoyed this movie a lot, and I enjoyed that father and son, and the prisoners especially really touched me. The one particular prisoner that was up teaching the other ones about the fact that this is the box masculinity used to be in, and let's deconstruct that box because we don't have to be in that anymore as men. And it's been really beautiful to be able to see my daughters engage with boys in this community who aren't stuck in that box. And so I just want to say thank you, because I'm new to this community and I've really seen beautiful, sensitive, vulnerable young men here, and it's really impressed me.
And I would like to add that as a father of two daughters, with the risk of exposing my two daughters, that when there's women alone, there's a lot of farting and burping that goes along when there's no men around too. And I'd like to dispel that myth immediately.
Thank you both. I think those are important points. Yes.
I was glad that Bill brought up the coach idea, because I think that went through the movie of the idea of historically of the screaming coach on the sidelines. My husband has taught me, he's a coach, and he's taught me that there's a positive coaching movement in this country that emphasizes, for both males and females, the positive part of being a mentor and being and helping build character and have those expectations in addition to the athletic ambitions they have. And I've really appreciated that. I've learned that from him and how important that is. Coaches, whatever way you meet them in your life. So, thank you.
I'll just piggyback that Chris Burke, our athletic director, the movie's going to him next week. So, and he's requested it for his coaches and to start the conversation.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
I have a question. I enjoyed a lot of aspects about the movie, and one of them was seeing the conversations that were happening in the prisons and the schools with the men being really vulnerable, and I look at that and think it's beautiful, but I feel at a loss of how to start that conversation with the men in my life who are great people, but especially family, and I just see how deep it goes back on, they just raised with those ideas of, you know, masculinity, and so I guess how do I even start that conversation with them without it getting shut down?
Can I ask something related to that? I'm curious if it rang true for you that you were compelled to subvert certain feelings and certain actions and certain tendencies. If that did ring true for you, if there was a point at which you if there was, some of the people spoke to, I became aware that I was not supposed to do this or I was supposed to do this, and if you were aware of that time in your life, if you became aware of that, and then if there was, on the flip side, if there was a time where you became aware, where you made a conscious decision to act otherwise, and to connect to Zoe, what you were saying is like, did somebody, was there a role model, was there an event that helped you get there, was there a way that helped you communicate or open up or be aware of it?
It sounds like those questions are kind of both about vulnerability and if there was a point when that switched for you where you felt safer being more vulnerable. Is that right? Just to put it succinct?
Yeah.
Cool.
And also if there's a point where of being aware of like, oh wait, I'm supposed to act this way.
Okay, so becoming aware of like the mask you wear, so to speak. Yeah? And also how to start a conversation about vulnerability and being more open with the men in our lives. Yeah? This is going to be the last of the audience questions, just so you know. If you want to talk more, then we're all people that live in Homer. I'm going to go here first.
I think addressing your question, you might refer the people to YouTube and watch this film before you approach it. And then say, well, what do you think? And that could start a conversation.
I'm gonna go to something you said, and I think it goes back to, at the end of the day, we should all be able to walk into a room and just be human and express ourselves however the hell we want to express ourselves. I, of course, am in agreement, and I'm sure a lot of people nowadays are in agreement with you. But I think one thing that I heard in the movie is that spoke true with me is we're all coming out of tradition. We've been influenced throughout our lives, and this is even going to your question about, how do you approach that? Man, yeah, not only do you have to show them that movie, but you have to be involved with them so well that you know why they display. So you have to almost be smarter than them to really have that conversation and move them into a place where they're almost in checkpoint, and they really have to look at themselves. And that is an extremely hard thing for a man to do in contemporary culture if they're very caught up in the toxic version of it. Or not the toxic version, but in a very rigid version of it. But the reason is we're coming out of tradition, and therefore, there are certain things within me anxieties within me that, like I said, for me, where those anxieties were kind of dispelled, or those disillusions were dispelled, is in a setting where it was all men, for an example, and I saw a man represent himself differently than normally a man has in a group of all men. He showed a side of vulnerability, he showed sensitivity, and for me that was a groundbreaking moment when I realized this is okay. Like, somebody in a group of men who are all very dominant and very strong-headed just said no. to something that everyone normally goes yes to. And they had an extreme effect. And it was because they spoke up and they were who they wanted to be. And it's amazing how simple it is. But for me, because of certain anxieties, I wasn't even able to, or certain men were able to even expose that in a mixed setting. And so for me, like, I agree with you 100%. In an ideal world, I think that's what we're working towards. I mean, look what we're doing. But at the same time, we're coming from a place, and we can never forget where we are, because if we do, then we're actually just spinning our wheels.
So talking about vulnerability, that's based in trust. Something that this film actually does pour for the little municipality that is Homer. A lot of the men that are showed in this video are from the lower 48, mainly the inner city. And the thing you have to keep in concern about is vulnerability is based upon almost the ability to be vulnerable with and share feelings is based upon trust. There's a whole industry based upon lack of trust to people and dealing with that violently. And with that, without that trust, we're constantly having the mask on. As much as we try to be part of the human condition, that we're all one space, one people, everything else. That is the ideal that we're trying to come from, or try to obtain. But the reality is, we are tribal. We do have enemies. And because those facts are our reality, we have, as men, have a hard time trusting. The reality is, if I have, say, from a gang perspective, if I shared my vulnerabilities to an opposing gang member, guess what? They're gonna use that against me. The enemy will use it against you. And that is a hard truth for people to stomach and deal with. Luckily, in a setting like Homer, we don't have enemies, hopefully. We have that opportunity. But the fact is, there is still that discrimination, there's still that lack of trust, there's still that lack of ability to be vulnerable. Because even within this beautiful hamlet, we do have division, we do have that bifurcation, we do have that conflict, because we're not entirely part of one tribe, so to speak. And with that, this is where we have to accept there are those differences, but from that we can build those bridges and start building that empathy, that trust, and actually break down the walls where enemies are no longer there. But we have to accept the fact that that is a sense of tradition that is still there. And because as humans, we're animals. The bigger, the faster, the stronger means that we can breed more availably. So with that, we want to project that strength, but we also want to be empathetic and caring. It's a weird paradox that we're in. It's dealing with social needs and carnal needs, so to speak. So that's a hard answer.
I guess I want to bestow a slight caution. We're talking about a spectrum, right? I mean, it's not across the whole board, and not everybody is going to be, super vulnerable and cry at puppy movies, and it doesn't necessarily mean they're broken, that they don't. And that's not just for men, it goes across genders. And so I think one of the important things in starting these kind of conversations is not coming from a point of, I'm going to fix you, or there's something wrong with you, because that doesn't work.
Can I just offer something a little gentler than this movie to start a conversation?
Sure.
So I am married to a son of the West, Iowa farm hand and ranch hand, and all those kind of tough stuff in Wyoming. And we've raised two sons together who are in college now. And based on conversations that I've had with my husband, I recommend going back to season 1 and watching This Is Us with the men in your life, because the writing is incredible, and the modeling of different versions of being a man, of taking all of those strengths that you think you need to have at all times, and how you bring them to bear, and when you set your basket down. Based on conversations that I had with him, he is getting so much out of this material that didn't require us to really talk about it head on, but it's just laid out right there, and with some incredible writing, and maybe a little less, I'm gonna fix you, than that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. I'm involved with, I'm very passionate about media and consuming it responsibly, and I think it has a huge effect. And so, yeah, you know, if the man in your life or whomever, if you have somebody rigid and you're trying to get them to see something different, one way I would, find your show or whatever show gives an example of a man that's kind of being vulnerable, and don't expect them to be that. Just ask them what they think about that. That's where that conversation is. Like, what do you think about this when you see this? I'm seeing this. It kind of gets contrasting to you. We had this conversation. What do you think? You know, it's a good place to come from.
It's getting late, and I know a lot of people want to go home and go to bed, just like most people already have. So I'm going to ask one more kind of concluding question, and we're already kind of on that track, if that's okay. And then I'm going to say thank you in a lot of words. We're kind of already on the track, like I said, but what active steps can you or anybody here take today in order to encourage healthy attitudes around masculinity at all levels of society, or just like to raise healthy young people and encourage the other people in your lives to be healthy?
I think it all depends what kind of male you are. You know, like each one of us have a different role to play, a different atmosphere. Just also, if you're a woman, what role as a woman are you playing in a man's life? I think it's important to think about that, and then think about how you're being seen, and apply what we're talking about here today and see, well, yeah, maybe that is a little toxic, that habit. Maybe I should change that or do this. I think if you're seen as a role model, then do it correctly and learn from conversations like this. And if you're not a role model and you're still learning about what it is to exist in this culture and be who you want to be, mix yourself with the right people. It's hard sometimes. Sometimes it's no fun. Sometimes you feel like you're missing out, but ultimately it's going to pay off in the end. You're going to be a more fulfilled and whole person, and the other people aren't going to be. They're going to be whatever that stereotype is. So just remember that. You know, if you're a role model, do your job, and if you're someone learning, be open to learning.
I think that, like you said, surrounding yourself with good people, but also to address those people that maybe aren't as fortunate to surround themselves with good people. We have the opportunity to try and demonstrate what being good can be. So sort of like leading by example is, I think, what we have the opportunity to do to raise healthy young males.
What was I going to say? Oh yeah, I think just being open to, I don't know, I had this epiphany when my daughter was like 5 or something, and I didn't have a male role model at home. But, or my dad left when I was 6. But I was telling my daughter something like this, and I just had this epiphany. I suddenly saw my dad and that great big hand coming down at me, you know, and like it changed the way I parented from then on. And, you know, it was just an amazing transformation. And I'm not sure how you can open yourself up to that type of epiphany, but it was powerful.
Guess I'm supposed to answer. I can just tell you what I do, and as far as it's being out there and walking the walk and talking the talk and being open to the ideas and putting yourself out there, and then just the realization that good people are made, not born. It's an active process. It's not passive. And so if you see the opportunity to make a positive impact, jump in there.
I could just add to that. Being aware, I think, is really important. I hadn't even really thought of this, to be honest, until the last few weeks when I was invited to be on this panel. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, and it's just made me so much more aware of the things that I say, and I think that's something that I'm going to continue experiencing. So I think anything in life, but absolutely you can apply it to this, just being aware and present as you conduct your life.
I guess I'll close this. Main points is be a professional, be a leader, and be honest. Something that I have holding for my children, which I extend to my students and my athletes, is I want them to be better than me. I want them to be smarter. I want them to be more compassionate or empathetic. I want them to be better leaders. I want them to be more technically and professionally proficient than I am. I want them to become better because they are our future. So we live up to that example, set that example, they will become that example. So, as Brian said, walk the walk and talk the talk.
I'm going to steal your closure and throw one thing out there. So one of the more powerful moments in the movie for me was basically one sentence, and he talked about the expectation. You know, the number one indicator for how well a kid's going to do in school is expectation. And it's true, it's the Pygmalion Effect. A guy named Rosenthal coined it. And basically, it comes down to what you expect of young people is what you get. And if you expect a punk, you're going to get a punk. And if you expect a good person, they rise to the occasion. And it's been reproduced often, so it's a good effect.
I know, this is annoying. I would say the last thing too is when you see what you think is like a toxic example of masculinity, engage in it. Have a conversation with that person. That's the other important thing. It's important to be nice, but it's also really important to just engage in conversations and remind people that people are watching. You know, if you see a high school coach or something yelling at your son, talk to him. Maybe your high school coach is a little more in tune with your kid than you, and he knows he's motivated by X, Y, and Z, or maybe that coach isn't aware that that's a toxic way of coaching your son. You know what I mean? There's a lot that can be learned from just engaging, and so that's really important to remember too.
Last word.
Hey, I get the last word. Cool, thank you. I'm also gonna add, I like the phrase calling people in rather than calling people out, so that when you do witness something that may be unsavory or hit you in a tough way, I find that when we call people out, we further alienate them, whereas when we call them in, we open up the conversation for growth and healing, whatever that might be. So that's something I like to think about. Yeah, so thank you so much for coming and sticking around for this entire thing, and thank all of you very much for letting me put you on the spot and for being super open and